I think that the concerns about a war are overstated, and I think the evidence suggests that this is really a campaign of psychological warfare.
That's the voice of James Lee, a postdoctoral research associate for the Project on Great Power competition at the UC Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Michelle Dover.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Hey, Michelle, great to see you. How was your weekend?
My weekend was good, although I must say all this news about Omicron is definitely throwing my holiday plans askew. Hope everyone gets the chance to get vaccinated, stay masked, wash your hands, and hang in there. How was your weekend?
We have some family coming to visit, and we're trying to get some of those rapid home tests. And I mean, forget it. You can't get those things no matter how much you're willing to pay for them. I mean, it's just everyone just be as careful as you can. But, people have made their holiday plans and they're going to stick to them, and it's going to be rough. But my weekend, other than looking for rapid tests, my weekend was pretty good. Clean the house, getting ready for all of our visitors, which was exciting as always. And still kind of obsessed with this fake Christmas tree thing. As listeners will know, we actually bought a fake Christmas tree because we have an allergy in the family. And I've now been doing research on fake Christmas trees. You would not believe. So this is one of those things. Every once in a while, I bump up against something that makes me realize what kind of a bubble I live in. I don't know anyone else other than myself now with a fake Christmas tree. But here's some tree trivia for you, Michelle. Of all the people that are putting out Christmas trees in their homes this year in the United States, what percentage of those trees are fake?
I would guess 45?
That's a very good guess. But the reality, which shocked me as well, 85% of all the trees
That's wild.
that people are putting up this year are fake. And it just made me realize, I'm living in a bubble, right? I don't know anyone who's got a fake tree. I don't know anyone who's unvaccinated. I know very few people in the military. All these kind of things, I keep bumping up against these things and I realize that I am not in the real America. This is just absolutely shocking. But anyway, learn something new every day. Turning to nuclear news, Russia has set out new demands for a security pact with NATO, including that NATO should not extend membership to Ukraine. Good luck with that one. I'm not a fan of NATO expansion, but that's a bold request that will be certainly rejected. The seventh round of the Iran nuclear deal talks in Vienna wrapped up last week with very little progress, sad to say. Talks are expected to resume again soon. But as the United States and others are stressing, time is running out for a deal. Some good news. About 700 scientists, including 21 Nobel laureates, sent a letter to President Biden last week asking him to declare, among other things, that the U.S. will not use nuclear weapons first. This is a significant ask from a great group of scientists, and thanks to the Union of Concerned Scientists for organizing. And also, at the very last minute before Congress left town, two important nominations for the Biden administration were finally confirmed. Adam Scheinman will be the U.S. representative to the upcoming, and I mean upcoming very soon, starting next month, Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, an important conference that I'm really glad we have a representative who's going to be there for us. And Laura Holgate, who is going to be the U.S. representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency and other agencies in Vienna. So it's really great news that they are both on board. And Michelle, what do you have lined up for early warning?
On early warning, we talk a little bit of good news, actually, when it comes to the Korean Peninsula. We discuss what we mentioned last week, that there's been potentially an agreement in principle among certain states to declare an end to the Korean War. And so we're going to talk about what that means, what that would be, and what would be next steps if that is in fact adopted. So you're not going to want to miss it.
And then I sit down with James Lee. He is with the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. And we discussed the U.S.-China situation with Taiwan. I really wanted to understand why the United States might risk a war with China, which of course could go nuclear, over Taiwan. And I think we have a great conversation about that, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback, your comments, your suggestions is what makes this show better. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Today I'm joined by Christine Ahn, founder and executive director of Women Cross DMZ. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Michelle. Great to be on with you again.
So great to see you. As you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear and national security news starting now. This past week, South Korea's President Moon Jae-in said the United States, China, and North Korea agreed on, quote, fundamental and principal levels, end quote, to declare a formal end to the Korean War, which, as listeners might remember, ended in 1953 with a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. Christine, why is this important?
Oh, it is so important to break the stalemate that has long overshadowed the Korean Peninsula since the breakdown in talks in 2019 in Hanoi. And this is a long demand of the Korean people to finally bring closure to this war that has languished on for 71 years. So it's a call from the Korean people and from peace movements all around the world that have been supporting Koreans' wishes for an end to this war that has languished on for 71 years. And in the Panmunjom Declaration that the North and South Koreans agreed to in 2018 that set forth this incredible period of summits between the leaders, they said that we were going to transform the Korean Peninsula from a land of war to one of peace, and that there were several steps, and an end of war declaration was the beginning. That then after that, they would negotiate a peace agreement, and that would set forth a peace regime. And this is long overdue. And it's very exciting to me that if President Moon is correct, that all sides have come to the table, that we may actually see a major diplomatic breakthrough to formally bring an end to this war.
Now, formal hostilities had ceased in 1953 to now is a long time to go without a peace treaty. How did this idea enter into the debate over what diplomatic options were available?
Well, it has been in many agreements and declarations that have been negotiated between the US and North Korea and between North and South Korea. But we haven't necessarily seen all the parties come together to say it's time to end the Korean War and that we need to set forth the actual mechanisms to transform this conflict. And there are, those that are raising the red flags, and saying that this is actually not true peace, that this would be destructive, this is absurd. And unfortunately, they aren't offering anything. And what we know, especially the plowshares community knows well, is that the only thing that actually led to tangible reduction of North Korea's nuclear program and that actually froze its program was the agreed framework, right? That lasted from 1994 to 2002, and that prevented North Korea from producing at least 100 nuclear weapons. So what we know is that the only thing that actually can lead to denuclearization, which is a US policy goal, is peace, is diplomacy, is dialogue and engagement. And we haven't seen that since 2019. And so what we need to do is get back on track. There are many that say, oh, this is Moon's last attempt. But this is not a political issue. This is not a partisan issue. I've spoken to Korean War veterans, American soldiers who have served. I've spoken to families of veterans who are still missing in Korea. I've spoken to Korean American families that still remain divided. I've spoken to humanitarian aid workers who have lived in North Korea, that have been on the ground in North Korea. And even Thomas Quintana last week, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea human rights. Everybody is in agreement that we cannot see advancement in either denuclearization or improved human rights or the humanitarian conditions of North Korean people without a formal end to the Korean War. And it is just what makes sense. It is the only thing that has worked and that will work. And so it's time to give peace a chance.
You talk about the peace treaty as a starting point and not an end point, which I think is very different than how many have thought about it here in the United States in the lead up to some of these talks. What comes next if they are able to reach a formal agreement ending the war?
My understanding is right now it's just a declaration. It's not even an agreement. I mean, what we found in our Path to Peace report that we produced from the Korea Peace Now campaign, or what we argue is if that is the intention, is to formally end the Korean War, then it can stand. But it's, a declaration is not a legally binding agreement. And I think from the North Korean side, they're going to want something that is more tangible, that is a security assurance. They always refer to the quote unquote hostile US policy as justification for keeping their nuclear weapons. And so if we actually want to see tangible reduction of the nuclear arsenal on the Korean Peninsula, we're going to actually have to see some kind of both a binding agreement, but then actual steps towards normalization. And I'm grateful that the Biden administration recognizes that the last 30 years hasn't worked. And that is either a combination of strategic patience under the Obama administration, which is we're not going to do anything. We're going to just let things grow fallow. And that's dangerous because that means North Korea is just continually increasing their nuclear arsenal, their long-range missile capacity. So we have to challenge that frame that the past just hasn't worked. I mean, I think the only window is when the agreed framework was in place, when we actually saw tangible progress. And, for many that may know this history, but the US was this close to negotiating a non-aggression pact, which is probably the step before an actual peace agreement. And that was in the final days of the Clinton administration. William Perry, the Secretary of Defense, led this incredible process that built trust, that the number 2 in command from North Korea came to the White House to meet with Bill Clinton. We were so close to actually seeing an end to the Korean War. And unfortunately, that was quashed by the Bush administration, George W. Bush, when North Korea landed on the axis of evil. And, this is the Korean people. This is a war that affects millions of Korean families. This is a war that still lives on in the hearts and the need for healing for veterans all around the world. And this is a war that still impacts the day-to-day existence of North Korean people who have nothing to do with the decision about whether their regime has nuclear weapons or not. So I think what we need to do is kind of reframe the way that this discourse has been set by the past, which is we're only going to get to peace after North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons. And what we're saying is that is upside down. We actually need to have peace. We actually need to have normalized relations. We actually need to have some basis of trust in order to actually see through the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And that also includes the US, how did nuclear weapons even get introduced on the peninsula? Truman threatened to use them during the Korean War. The US put them secretly in South Korea up until George Bush Sr. So it is really time to have an honest conversation, and I think to be pragmatic. And my hope is that President Biden is going to stick to his commitment to end America's endless wars. And it was not Afghanistan that is the longest war. It is actually in Korea. And that is what we as Women Cross TMZ, we as the Korea Peace Now campaign hope and we believe can happen. And it's the incredible work of grassroots movements from the Korean Peninsula across the United States, all around the world, that is working together to try to bring closure to the longest war.
Christine, I can't believe our time is up, but thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for all you and your network that you are a part of have done to push for an end to this war.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Fisk, Deputy Director of Development at Plowshares Fund and a Press the Button listener. When I first joined Plowshares Fund back in 2018, I didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. I came here with just the motivation to help create a safer world and a commitment to lifelong learning. My colleagues told me they'd teach me everything I need to know, and did they ever? Still do, actually. As I continue to grow ever more committed to Plowshares Fund and the reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons, I found that I rely on Press the Button so much. It's a resource for the latest analysis and a place where I can drop in fully, without distractions, and gain new insight into this issue I've come to know and love. I find inspiration from the weekly guests and our partners, and I know I'm a better contributor to our cause just by tuning in. Please consider supporting Plowshares Fund and helping make Press the Button possible by making a donation today. Or make it a holiday gift and send one of our festive e-cards to someone in your life who is also passionate about the pursuit of a safe and secure future. Visit plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Tensions are rising between the United States and China. The Pentagon has called China its primary adversary. And as we have discussed on this podcast, China is building new missile silos and exotic weapons as it seeks to counter a much larger U.S. nuclear force and missile defenses. As tensions escalate, one of the most likely sources of conflict between the two nations is Taiwan. Some argue that Taiwan could be the flashpoint that sparks an outright war between the United States and China. And President Biden has strongly implied that the U.S. would defend Taiwan in a war. So on today's show, I want to understand what is so important about Taiwan as to possibly justify a U.S.-China war, one that could be long and painful and could go nuclear. And how likely is it that Taiwan will draw the two sides into military conflict? To help us understand the history of Taiwan's relationship with the United States and China, we're joined by James Lee, a postdoctoral research associate at the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. He works on U.S. grand strategy in Europe and East Asia with a focus on Taiwan. James, great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So tensions have been increasing in the Taiwan Strait, with Beijing increasing military drills and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin saying that those drills appear to be rehearsals for an invasion. So give us the history here. How did Taiwan become such a source of tension?
The history begins in 1949 when the former government of China, the Republic of China, was defeated in the Chinese Civil War and then moved to Taiwan. And ever since 1949, Taiwan and mainland China have been governed separately, but Taiwan has never formally declared independence. And mainland China has never renounced the use of military force to achieve unification between Taiwan and the mainland. So this has been an unresolved issue from the Cold War.
So that explains why Taiwan is so important to China. But why is Taiwan so important to the United States?
In terms of the United States' strategic interest, Taiwan has a very important geographic position in the middle of the first island chain. That's a geographic argument. In terms of the geoeconomic or the economic security argument, there's also the consideration that Taiwan is now one of the world's most important centers for the manufacturing of computer chips, especially high-end computer chips. So the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, has about a 50% of global market share for manufacturing computer chips. And for the very high-end chips, that market share is about as much as 90%. So it's an incredibly important company. And Taiwan generally has a vital role to play in the global semiconductor supply chain. So given that there are all these new technologies that are being commercialized and they're relying to a large extent on TSMC's chips, that means that the future of geoeconomics really depends on the security of these supply chains and the security of Taiwan. Those are what you might call the hard interest that the United States has in the security of Taiwan. But then there's also the more ideological aspect of Taiwan security, which is the fact that Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. It's the only democracy in the Chinese-speaking world. And it's a political and an economic miracle. And Taiwan demonstrates a kind of ideological alternative to the Chinese Communist Party. So there are both material and kind of non-material factors why Taiwan is important to the United States.
Right. I mean, you kind of get the sense that the United States is in some ways committed, although we'll talk more about what that means, but committed to the preservation of democracy in Taiwan, almost as a statement of the U.S. support for democracy globally, and as a statement to China, right, that the United States, in a sense, knows no limits in as far as it will go to protect democracy, even up to China's doorstep.
Right. And in the longer kind of view of Chinese history, Taiwan is also very important for the idea of democracy in modern China, because the Republic of China was founded in 1912 with the vision that China's future was to be a democratic and modern nation. So this is not a Western concept that's being forced onto China. It's a Chinese concept that was developed by Sun Yat-sen with the idea that China's eventual historical and political development was the achievement of democracy. And so in the longer view of Chinese history, Taiwan is also very important in that regard.
So President Xi has publicly stated that he wants reunification with Taiwan. In your view, does China have the military capability to invade Taiwan? And if so, would China want to invade Taiwan, or do they have other goals here?
So I think that China has the capability to invade and occupy Taiwan, but the question is, can they do so at an acceptable cost? And I think that right now, the evidence suggests that they don't think the costs warrant an invasion. And they have a long-term objective of unifying Taiwan with the mainland, but the cost would just be too high. And one of the critical factors behind that kind of assessment is the possibility of the United States intervention and the possibility of the United States and its allies intervening together to defend Taiwan from a PRC invasion. So they have the capability, but at this point, it would still be too costly for them to attempt such an invasion. With regard to the question of whether or not they have other objectives, so Taiwan is very important to the PRC, but has other objectives as well. Xi Jinping has a long-term agenda of turning China into a world-class military and technological and economic power. And if a war were to break out over Taiwan right now, it could derail that project entirely. I think that the costs of kind of a conflict are still too high from the PRC's perspective.
Now, looking at the U.S. side for a minute, there seems to be a lot of confusion about what kind of military commitment the United States has made to Taiwan, with many seeming to think that the United States has committed to defend Taiwan like we have committed to defend NATO, Japan, and South Korea. But that is not the case. Is that correct?
That is not the case. This is a point of confusion. And I think it comes from the fact that a lot of people in the administration and outside the administration have used the word commitment to describe the United States' relationship with Taiwan. You often hear the phrase, our commitment to Taiwan is rock solid. And that can lead to a certain confusion because it sounds like Taiwan is in the same kind of category as NATO allies, Japan and South Korea, when in reality, the United States policy toward Taiwan is just a policy. The Taiwan Relations Act defines the United States policy toward Taiwan, but it doesn't have the sense of binding language toward the United States security relationship with Taiwan. So the Taiwan Relations Act says that it is the policy of the United States to provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive character. So it's a policy, but it's not an obligation that the United States has. And it is also the policy of the United States to maintain the capacity to resist any form of coercion or force that would jeopardize the security or well-being of the people on Taiwan. That's a very elaborate way of saying it, but basically the United States policy is to sell Taiwan arms and to maintain the capacity to intervene in Taiwan's defense, but there's no obligation on the part of the United States towards Taiwan in the Taiwan Relations Act.
And there's also U.S. training of the military in Taiwan, is that right?
Yeah, U.S. advisors have been training Taiwanese forces, and that was disclosed in recent months.
So you could say that the United States is trying to increase Taiwan's defenses to, as you said, send the message to China that it wouldn't be worth it, right? That it would be a painful slog to try to invade Taiwan.
Right. And Taiwan's government has emphasized that it does not take U.S. support for granted, and it is willing to take its own steps for developing its own military capabilities to resist a Chinese invasion. And so U.S. advisors are in Taiwan to help train Taiwan's own forces.
We've also heard about the One China policy. Tell us how that relates to Taiwan and the U.S.-China relationship.
So the One China policy is the United States' long-standing policy toward Taiwan and the Taiwan issue. And it's been in place since the 1970s. And it means that the United States recognizes one Chinese government, which is the People's Republic of China, and the United States maintains unofficial relations with Taiwan, economic, cultural, and other unofficial relations with Taiwan. That's the broad concept. Underneath that concept, the United States is neutral on the substance of Taiwan's political status. So the United States considers Taiwan's status to be undetermined, and the United States does not have a preference for either unification or independence for Taiwan. But the United States does have a preference over process. So the United States is opposed to the use of force to decide the Taiwan issue. And it's because of this preference for a peaceful resolution of this issue that the United States sells arms to Taiwan and has a policy of maintaining the capacity to intervene in Taiwan's defense. So officially, the United States is neutral on sovereignty issues.
Now, you talked a little bit about the importance of the computer chip industry in Taiwan for the sort of the economic context of this. Given that, are there efforts to diversify that dependence? I mean, one would think that if we were considering war over Taiwan to protect the computer chip industry there, one might think maybe we should move it somewhere else. Are there thoughts along those lines?
There are thoughts along those lines. The CHIPS Act, which is currently being debated in Congress, would potentially allow for U.S. funding to subsidize Taiwan's efforts to offshore some of its manufacturing capacity in the United States. The most advanced technology would stay in Taiwan, but some of the advanced technology would be offshore to the United States. The company TSMC is already building manufacturing plants in Arizona at the moment to try to address some of these U.S. concerns, but it's likely that the most advanced technology would still stay in Taiwan. So the U.S. can reduce its dependence on Taiwan to some extent, but not completely.
Gotcha. Now let's take a broader look at, what the motivations of China might be. I mean, some speculate that President Xi seeks to reunify with Taiwan as a way to solidify his legacy. Do you think he sees it in broad terms like that?
I think he might see that as his legacy. If he's leader of China for the foreseeable future, then he might see that as his kind of long-term legacy of maybe decades down the line if he's able to achieve unification between Taiwan and the mainland. But I think his more near-term and intermediate kind of goal is to create the perception that under his leadership, China has developed the effective capability of deterring Taiwan from declaring independence, and that independence is no longer an option for Taiwan to consider. He wants to create that legacy, and this military modernization is partly driven by that need to contain Taiwan's aspirations for independence. But I think that the concerns about a war are overstated, and I think the evidence suggests that this is really a campaign of psychological warfare that the PRC is waging against Taiwan and the United States. I think they're trying to undermine the confidence of the people of Taiwan and to create this fear of an imminent invasion so that Taiwan will come to the bargaining table. So I think that Taiwan needs the United States support, but we shouldn't overreact and feel the perception that an attack on Taiwan is imminent.
Now, finally, because we're running out of time, what do you think is the best outcome here, right? How do Beijing and Washington avoid direct conflict over Taiwan, and what happens next?
So I think that the best outcome is the status quo. Doesn't fit on a bumper sticker to say, let's keep the status quo. But I think that is the best case scenario because Taiwan right now does not have legal independence, but it enjoys a high degree of autonomy and effectively acts as if it were independent. And so it has a great deal of freedom under the current arrangement, even though it doesn't have that kind of formal independent status. So I think that the status quo is the best scenario for Taiwan. But there's the challenge of maintaining that status quo into the future. I think that the part of the solution for maintaining the status quo is for the United States and China to come to not necessarily an agreement, but at least some kind of understanding that they're both looking at the situation in very different ways. China is looking at this situation and saying that it is defending the status quo, and the United States is pushing the envelope on independence. The United States thinks that China is trying to change the status quo and force unification of Taiwan. And so they both look at this in very different ways. And both sides see the other side as the revisionist state that's trying to challenge the status quo. So as long as the two sides can come to understanding about how they're both feeling tension and try to find some way of dialing back these kinds of escalatory actions in the Taiwan Strait. And I think that will help to stabilize the situation.
James, thank you so much for your time. We're going to have to leave it there, but we wish you all the best in your work.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kelly, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Bridget, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Zepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.